Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Lucinda Rouse.
And I'm Andy Ricketts. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. And this week we'll be talking about best practice when it comes to managing a big organisational change or restructure.
That's right. We've heard about many of the sector giants initiating major structural changes in recent months. Some in response to funding shortfalls, others to ensure that an organisation is best placed to deliver on its evolving strategy, and some a bit of both. But these big changes can be hard to manage, particularly when personal stakes are high and employee livelihoods are put at risk. So how do you get it right?
And we have two guests with us in the studio to help us answer this. First up is Iain Heaton, Deputy Chief Executive and Chief Financial Officer at the animal welfare charity, the Blue Cross. Iain has been at the forefront of some major changes at the charity in recent years, which we will come to very shortly. Hello, Iain. Thanks for joining us.
Hello. Lovely to be here.
Also with us is Tiggy McCool, partner at the project management consultancy 9 Feet Tall. Tiggy has worked with Iain and his team at the Blue Cross on a major restructure. Hello, Tiggy.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Iain, let's start with you. Tell us about these two big changes at the Blue Cross that Andy alluded to that you've been part of.
At the Blue Cross in 2021, we started some work to change quite dramatically our rehoming services. Partly that was because of the COVID pandemic and the sort of pressure that we were feeling as an organisation, but also it was because we were aware as an organisation that the world of rehoming cats, dogs, small animals, etc. was due for a change, and we needed to move away from slightly old-fashioned models of animals coming in, being in a kennel or a cattery, and then going back out to a home. But, we had various new ways of doing it through foster homes and home direct and so on. And we wanted to do more of that because it is better for animal welfare and more efficient as a charity as well. However, the first part of the change we had to make was, unfortunately, during COVID, was we actually shut 4 of our rehoming centres, partly because of financial pressure, partly because a couple of them were single species, and we needed to take that opportunity to move forwards as an organisation. However, more positively, in the last couple of years, we have completely changed how our remaining rehoming centres, the teams at those sites are structured. We have added in new roles, and we have been able to completely change the process that pets and people will go through when they're on that rehoming journey.
Thank you. It will be very interesting to hear how those two different restructures took place and the planning that went into them, where you've got those different motivations behind them. And Tiggy, you and 9 Feet Tall are a proponent of organisational design, which I understand was a methodology or a concept that was used to help the Blue Cross. What is organisational design in a nutshell?
So organisational design is talked about, OD is talked about a lot, and it's like some other words that get bandied around. So when we talk about organisational design, we talk about how do you make sure that the structures and the roles and the capabilities that you have in the organisation are fit to deliver your strategic goals and objectives? So making sure that there's really clear alignment between the two. And when we started working with Iain and the team, they were just setting out some of the key things they wanted to achieve through their strategy. And you'd set out your strategic initiatives, so some key programs of work that they wanted to deliver to make sure that they delivered on the strategy. And part of that was looking at rehoming and the services that were provided, and then the skills and capabilities within Blue Cross that they needed to be able to deliver that to families and animals, and how they would best do that. So the OD is making sure that those things are aligned and you've got the right skills and they're sitting in the right parts of the organisation.
And can you tell us a bit about the process that you go through for organisational design? What does that look like and what are the different steps?
We start off encouraging organisations to think about, as we've just talked about, what their scope is and what their vision for the future is. So knowing where you want to get to, and in that thinking about what are some of the key principles that you want to hold to in your design. So design principles and making sure they're really clear. And that might be about achieving financial stability, or it might be about reducing costs, or it might be about baking in things like ED&I, so diversity and equality into your recruitment processes, so having some guardrails around the design. Then going into design itself, so there are a couple of elements in there. So there's the high level design, so the kind of principles of what you want to achieve. And then as you progress, there's the detailed design, so you get into the number of roles and the types of skills that you need in each particular area of the organisation. And then the test phase, where you actually test some of the thinking that you've been talking about and make sure that actually it's going to work in practice, because sometimes it looks good on paper, but when you take it out and you speak to people, you think, oh no, actually that's not quite right. So testing and validating that and finalising that design. And then there's 3 more phases after that. One is about planning for the transition to the new model and then the new design, so making sure you've got everything ready before you start it. And then going into the actual transition, so moving people into different roles, sometimes, unfortunately, people moving out of role and exiting the organisation, and then tracking that actually your new design is working.
Sounds like a lot of groundwork needs to be done before you go ahead. And Iain, at the Blue Cross, thinking of your second restructure in recent years, so the one that you started implementing in 2023, how long was that process from beginning to think about it, planning, and then execution?
I would say that actually, as an organisation, we have been talking about that since the changes we made in 2021. And I'm sure actually members of our rehoming senior leadership team, our rehoming director and others, probably had some of those ideas, and they could see the direction that the rehoming services needed to move in. We've always been, as a charity, quite keen to try and, bring in new ideas and look at how you can do things differently. So quite a few years ago, we started doing more pets through what we call our home direct service, where they don't actually come into our shelters, they go direct from one home to another. We started using foster homes quite a few years ago as well. And we could see the benefits of those sort of services, both on animal welfare, but also on the impact we can have as a charity and the efficiency of it as a charity. You don't actually then need to have so many pets on site. It doesn't cost you quite as much to rehome each pet. So the thinking had been there for a number of years. In terms of the detailed planning, like I said, I think we started that work after we'd got through the closures of centres in 2021. We presented a full business case to our board of trustees as to what we wanted to do next in mid-2022. And then we went into the implementation stage in sort of 2023. So it is a long process. The work that was used to build up that business case for what we wanted to do was a huge amount of work involving teams from all over the organisation to really look at a model, what the new design of those teams would do and what it would deliver in terms of pets we could help. So we were sort of modelling, what do we help now using our current levels? If we change to this new model, how many extra pets will we help and what will the cost per pet be?
So what has that looked like? How is the Blue Cross different now to how it was at, say, the beginning of 2023?
So we have more people employed in our rehoming teams, but also the actual roles that we have are very different. Whereas we used to have more generalist roles. So you'd have someone in a rehoming centre and they would do a bit of this and a bit of that, and they might answer phone calls from people looking to give up a pet or adopt a pet. They might also go and help with the animals on the floor. We now have far more specialist roles. So we have admissions roles, we have adoptions roles, we have pet care roles. That means that people are more focused on those areas, and we're seeing a number of pets we can help increase dramatically in the last 2 years, and it should carry on increasing in the next few years as well as we become slicker and more efficient in different areas. Those are the major changes we are seeing. It does also, obviously, unfortunately, cost a little bit more because you've got more people in there overall, but the cost per pet help is dropping.
And then in terms of the various steps that you went through then, what difference did it make to have this sort of framework to rely on as you went through this process?
You've got to have a framework or a structure when you're looking at these pieces. I think you've got to have a process you can follow to work out where you want to get to as an organisation, and then actually before you go into implementation stage, be really confident that that end goal you're aiming at is based on evidence and research and certainty as much as possible. I mean, nothing is certain in life, but as much as possible, because otherwise I think you can come up with ideas and they may seem good in principle, but unless you've consulted with quite a few different people, they might just be one or two people's ideas. So I think having a really good, thorough research sort of phase and design phase is really important.
Designing based on assumptions is dangerous. So actually going and collecting facts and evidence and consulting with a small c, so not as an official HR type consultation, is really important through that design phase, because sometimes design can just happen in a room with a few leaders. And if you don't expand that out to consider people who are doing the day job, sometimes you can end up with designs which actually then in practice don't deliver what they promise to. So that point about going through and following a process and making sure that you're testing and checking all the time, I think is really key, and it leads to much better results.
And then also there must be sometimes a kind of disjoint between what you planned would happen and then how it works in practice. Do you have any advice for organisations who realise that perhaps their goals have changed during this process of change or restructure, and how they can make sure that the potential to adapt accordingly is baked into how they're going to execute their change?
Yeah. I mean, it's tricky, isn't it? Because the external context is changing all the time. So what we encourage is particular governance, which sounds, that word's bandied around a lot, but checkpoints to make sure that actually you're reconvening as a group to just make sure that things haven't changed. Sometimes we're involved in projects whereby a financial imperative has come in. So timeframes which initially seemed really reasonable then become challenged because there's an imperative to get cost out in the organisation, and that driver comes to the top of the list. And so in that environment, I think it's really important to reset and come back together and to assess the scope of what you're looking to achieve and the timeframes that you have to achieve it, and then to check that plan and then be able to communicate about that. Because I think the challenge is the disconnect comes when things have changed but nobody's talking about it, or people are still under the misapprehension that the original plan is still out there. So I think having that recheck on a regular basis, that there are checkpoints throughout this process to say, are we still right? Have things changed? Do we need to alter our course slightly? And if we do, that's okay. But actually we need to make sure that we do that together and we're agreed and aligned in what we're doing, and then we're able to communicate that with people who need to know.
And Iain, how did that work then practically for you when you were going through the process? Did you have to make significant changes to what you were doing in response to feedback?
We didn't actually make any significant changes during our sort of actual implementation consultation phase, which I think is probably, testament to the fact that a lot of work had gone into planning it in advance. And also perhaps we weren't hit at that time with any significant external changes, so we could sort of stick to the course. I think it is tricky because the external world moves so rapidly at the moment around us all that things can crop up one day and disappear the next almost. But yeah, we didn't have to make any significant changes, but there were obviously pieces that came up during the consultation process that we then had to reflect on and perhaps make more smaller changes to either specific roles or elements within them.
The point about making changes after consultation is really key, because you can't finalise design until you've been through that consultation with your staff, with your teams. So another thing to bear in mind is when you're communicating with your board is to make sure that they are really in the know and understand the legal process that you've got to go through, and that you will not be able to finalise design and you won't be able to confirm redundancy costs if you have them, outplacement costs, anything like that, until you've been through this process and you know what the true end state is going to be.
You mentioned redundancies, first of all in 2021, yes, in response to your centre's closing. Yeah. But then again, in your more recent restructure, which wasn't so much on financial need grounds, no, but as a result of needing different types of skills to deliver the services of your recalibrated organisation. How did you go about managing staff concerns about change, even where there were new roles added. It must have been a worrying time for members of the Blue Cross workforce, particularly where they'd seen those redundancies back in 2021.
Yes, you can never underestimate probably just how much people will worry and get concerned about these pieces. It is really important to be as open and honest as you can, as early as you can be. And obviously the challenge sometimes is around the legalities of a consultation process and sort of employment law. But we tried to be open, honest throughout both those processes as to the reasons why. And I think actually, if people can see a compelling reason why, they understand things better. So if you can say, well, actually, we're having to do this because of financial pressures, or we're doing this because actually we believe that by making these changes, we will be able to help more pets in the future with a new model, actually people buy into it far more. Everything we do should ultimately come back to our charitable objectives. That is why those charities are there. That is the cause we are there for. So I think, people working in those charities do understand that. Obviously, it is hard when it has an impact on them as an individual and their role. If you communicate well, if you explain what the logic is behind the change, then that does help.
And was it plain sailing for you in that respect? Because we've just been covering recently the Dogs Trust announced, again, not due to financial necessity, but because of a strategic shift, that they would be making some redundancies. And they've had over 3,500 at the current moment signing a petition opposing it. How was it for you?
So in 2021, when we were closing centres, we did get some local petitions and pressure from local areas to sort of not close particular centres, but not to the sort of scale that Dogs Trust are currently seeing. In terms of the more recent consultation, there was obviously internal concerns and so on, but externally we didn't really get anything too much, because with the more recent work we were doing, we were adding about 40 roles. Yes, the roles were changing, they were different, but overall there was more roles. Some people still chose to leave the organisation at that stage because they felt the new role wasn't for them, or perhaps it was just a point in their life where it was a good moment to leave. But the more recent one, we didn't have those challenges at that time, but it is always a risk.
And interesting what you said about the importance of being open and honest as far as you can be. But obviously that is difficult, isn't it? Because you've got to have all of the information in front of you before you can communicate it. And there is a bit of a sweet spot about deciding when that moment is going to be. Tiggy, you must have experience of that across multiple organisations.
Yeah, and it is a really tricky balance. So some of the things that we recommend organisations do are to establish at the very start of the piece of work what your communication principles are, and then to communicate those to teams. So things like saying, we will, as soon as we can communicate something, we will. So if we haven't communicated something, it's because either we don't know or we can't legally give that information yet. But to make a promise or to contract to say this is how we will operate. And I think if you can share that early on, it gives confidence not only to teams on the ground but also to leaders who are having to communicate or not communicate something, because they can refer to the principles that have been agreed. And I think also making sure that you have really good legal and HR support is also key to giving you confidence about when you can go out and what you should say when, but making sure that all of the communication channels that you have available, such as if you've got unions or employee representative bodies, that they are kept in close quarters as much as you can, will give confidence for them to be able to speak to the people that they represent. So it's a tricky thing to get right, but I think going in with the idea that you will be as open as you possibly can is a really great starting point.
And there'll be some of our listeners who are working for small charities where they maybe only have a handful of people, and they'll be saying, well, we haven't got access to lawyers and HR experts, etc. What's your advice in terms of how they would apply these kind of principles if they're looking at making similar changes in their organisations?
So I think the principles are the same. I think one of the things that is really worth thinking about is what support structures you have around your organisation. So on your board, who do you have on your board and what network do they have? can you approach organisations and contacts who can find you pro bono support? So I think it's thinking about what you do need, because you will need HR support and you will need legal support, but can you find that if you don't have it within the organisation? Can you go and seek out support? Because lots of large organisations, as part of their CSR or ESG initiatives, want to help charities and want to be seen to be doing the right thing. So I think I would say go and ask, see what you can get.
And Iain, you're just over a year on from the end of your implementation period for your recent restructure. Is there anything that you learnt from the process that you think would be worth sharing with others, and also anything you might do differently next time?
Whenever you go through these processes, you do learn from it. And I think there's a few key things that probably we would take away from it. I don't think you can underestimate the sort of concerns of people or the questions people may ask during a consultation process. There's a level of detail that we had for some of the pieces we've done, but actually then it's not till you get some of those questions, you go, oh God, but actually we need to think about this in even more detail, about what these new roles will be doing and how we're going to train and support them in areas like that. I think also don't just fixate on the team who is having the change made. So we were very focused on our rehoming services because that is where we're making the change. But actually, when we look at it now, we go, well, yes, actually, but that does have an impact on other teams as well around the organisation when that change is happening, even though they're not being directly consulted with. And actually then further on, as we are now, a year or so down the line, actually we probably see more pressure on things like our support teams and areas like that. Because there's more people perhaps in our rehoming services, but also they're doing more. They're helping more pets and so on. And that actually has an impact on other teams like estates or HR or whatever it may be. We probably hadn't fully thought those pieces through. And I think that's a really important one to consider. I think also one of the things I took from it personally is I would view that second change very much as a positive change. We're adding roles, we're saying about a new way of doing rehoming, etc. But not everyone will view it that way. And I think actually you need to sometimes put yourself in the mindset of others to help you understand, how someone else may view it. And actually it may not be positive for everyone because people perhaps don't necessarily want their existing role to change or whatever it might be. So there's a lot we can take from it. There's always things you would do differently. But overall, we are pleased with how it has been implemented and rolled out across the organisation.
Very good to hear. And Tiggy, would there be anything that you would add in terms of recommendations for other charities that are embarking on a restructure? Any sort of top tips for things that they should be considering at the early stage?
Yeah. I think one thing that is underestimated is around the support your leadership team are going to need, because it's a really emotive journey. Teams who work in charities do that because they want to work somewhere that has a vision and a mission and is something that is fulfilling. And as a leadership team, that's why you've joined as well. So making these hard decisions is really tricky. And so it's really thinking early on about how you're going to support each other and how you're going to deal with some of the difficult questions. So that's on an emotional level. I think I've said already about making sure you've got really good HR and legal support, finding a way to get that support. And I think really practically, so some of the things that Iain was just talking about in terms of the detailed design and having everything ready. So when you start on this process, I think having documentation that people can complete. So when you're having conversations about the pros and cons of different types of decision and design, capturing all of that detail might seem a bit laborious at the time, but actually it's amazing 3 months later when someone asks you why you've considered X and not Y. If you haven't written it down, it's really difficult to answer that question. So I think actually getting some templates ready that you can then populate as you go through all of this, that records all these conversations that have been happening and the ideas and why some things are being taken forward and why some things haven't, is really helpful for any organisation that's doing this. So just thinking about the practicalities of capturing things early on so that then it's documented and you can refer back to it.
So if charities listening to this feel like they want to find out more about this, what sort of resources might be out there that will give them more information?
So we've written a guide called The Role of Design for Charities, which I hope is practical and helpful. And there are books on the subject as well. A book that I really like is about a concept called anti-fragility, which is about designing an organisation that gets stronger through change, and how you think about where you can move your resources around so your structure is not really rigid. It's by someone called Nassim Taleb, and I think that's a really interesting book, perhaps to get your leadership team to read before you start going into discussions around design and what you need from the organisation. So those are two things that hopefully might help.
Brilliant. Well, we will include your reading list in the show notes to this episode. Tiggy, Iain, it's been really great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Tiggy and Iain, and that's it for this episode. We'll be back again next week. And in the meantime, don't forget, if you'd like to send us any feedback or suggestions for future podcast episodes, you can always get in touch by filling in our listener survey. The link to that is in the show notes. From Andy and me and everyone at Third Sector, thank you so much for listening. Our producer is Jude Owen.